Welcome to another exciting episode of the Advanced Podcast. I'm your host, Vikas. Today, I'm joined by someone who has spent her career proving that meaningful change in education is not only possible, but scalable. Kruti Bharucha is the founder and CEO of Peepul, an organization working to strengthen India's public education system so that every child, no matter their background, has a fair chance at a good life. Her journey into education began not in policy rooms, but at home as a parent. Seeing firsthand the inequality in access and quality of education, Kruti decided to apply her leadership experience to serve children in government schools. What started in 2014 as the Exemplar Schools project has now grown into 7 programs across Madhya Pradesh and Delhi, improving learning outcomes for thousands of students. Before founding Peepul, Kruti worked in leadership roles across global institutions, including the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, McKinsey and Company, and the Corporate Executive Board. An economist by training, she holds degrees from the London School of Economics, the University of Maryland, and Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi. Her work has earned her recognition as Business World's 40 Under 40 list, as Social Entrepreneur of the Year, as one of the Economic Times Women Ahead leaders. Kruti's story is one of purpose, persistence, and possibility, a reminder that strong systems can be built when leadership meets compassion. Kruti, welcome to Advance. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Kruti, I'm really excited to have you on the Advanced Podcast this week. And, you know, when I think about your work, when I think about India, I think about the World's Best School Prizes, where you have a link, a concrete link to. Can you tell people who you are and why your work matters?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's wonderful to be here because you and I have had so many exciting, interesting conversations over the past 2 or 3 years. So it's actually nice to kind of sit down in a more structured way and chat about education policy reform. About myself, I am an economist by training. I started my career at McKinsey, then worked at the World Bank, the IMF, and then spent another decade at Corporate Executive Board, which is an advisory consulting firm. Made partner there. And then in 2014, just thinking about the education system, especially spurred on by the fact that my son was born, and I saw the shortcomings of the education system when I wanted to put him into school. I realized that there was such a gap in education outcomes for the poorest and most disadvantaged communities in India. And so 2014 is when I actually completely shifted sectors and moved into education and social impact and development. And it's been more than a decade now working in the education and social impact space.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the education scene in India? Vis-a-vis public education is where you are focused on. And obviously the podcast and what you've said begs the question, what school did your son go to? Did he go to a public school or a private school?
Well, every time I talk about the Indian education system, the first thing I often hear from folks who are not based in India is those are just crazy numbers, right? Like the scale is incredible. And it really is. I mean, at some point when we think about it's not thousands, it's not 100,000, it's millions of children and millions of schools. So there are, 120 million children studying in 1.2 million government schools in India across all states. This accounts for government schools account for about 65 to 70% of all schools in India. And so, it is a large chunk. Well, first of all, it's a large absolute number, which oftentimes to people is, incomprehensible just because of the magnitude of the problem here, the challenge here, the numbers. The other thing is, government schools are typically where they're accessible, they're in villages, in communities, there's proximity to households. It's also the place where over time, the poorest and most vulnerable parents, communities, families have sent their children. And so the future that we have is, how do we improve public school systems, government school systems, which is where the vast majority of tomorrow's citizens of India are going to study. And so if we can really significantly improve the delivery of education in government school systems, we're actually building a much better generation of citizens of India for the future that can contribute back to the country.
Remind me of the statistics again, the scale of the education system in India.
So 1.2 million government schools in India, 123 million children studying in those 1.2 million government schools.
And in terms of outcomes, what are the contours of that?
That's where the problem arises. And that's really the challenge that many of us, whether we are non-state actors or state governments or national government, that's really what we want to solve for. So, the latest, household survey data of education outcomes shows that 55% of children that finish primary school, so that's grade 5 in India, cannot even read at the level of grade 2. For math, 66% of children that finish grade 5 cannot perform grade 2 level math. And so you have, and so these are numbers that, show a huge deficit in learning, issues and problems with regard to student engagement. And what will typically happen is the child's learning gaps will just continue to grow as they go from 5 to 6. And then there's a tendency to just drop out of school completely. And so you lose an entire generation of potential high, enabling citizens for a stronger economy, a stronger country tomorrow. But that's where all of us come in to essentially try and lower those numbers, right? That's the problem that we want to fix. And in no world is that number or those sets of numbers acceptable, especially when we're talking about the numbers that we talked about, which is, this is the reality for 150 million children. So for 150 million children, 2/3 of those children, when they finish primary school, cannot do basic arithmetic.
And any education system, the backbone is its workforce. So teachers, in our case. Tell us a little bit about the situation regarding teachers in India.
So teachers in India are quite experienced. They are quite qualified. And the permanent tenured teachers who are in government schools actually are appointed through a series of tests, and they need the requisite qualifications. So you actually do have a teacher workforce in India that is quite large. There is an unevenness in teacher allocation across government schools. So some schools might have too few teachers, some schools might have too many teachers because there's a lag associated with the appointment and when the teacher is actually allocated to the school. But you do have this massive workforce of teachers across the country within government school systems that you can really do some magic with, right? I think what happens is, in many education systems, especially at this kind of scale with such a large teacher workforce, the problem becomes, or the challenge becomes, how do you make sure that the teachers are well skilled and are able to deliver according to the needs of what the students in the classroom require. And so a lot of the work, that is now being done is how do you shift or reimagine teacher professional development? How do you make it easier for the teacher to actually be a better teacher? Because the other thing that's happened is there has been a lot of teacher training, teacher upskilling, teacher capacity building. And that poor teacher is having a lot of stuff thrown at them continuously and is also expected to teach. And in India, and this is perhaps what's different about India, the teacher also gets involved in a lot of administrative tasks. So for example, voting duties, election duties, municipality responsibilities. So there is a lot of time that just gets wasted or spent on many of these administrative duties that are completely non-teaching related. So your time in the school becomes quite limited. And of that time in school, you then have to figure out what is the time in the classroom that the teacher is going to spend. And when the teacher is in the classroom, how skilled are they in actually adopting the best techniques to be able to engage children meaningfully?
Kruti, you talk about the huge challenge in India with regards to scale. You talked about outcomes improving, but still not really good. We talked about, you provided some optimism about the state of the workforce, but I remember, I take you back to a time when the teacher eligibility test came into force. And I remember the kind of pass rate of teachers who'd if I'm not mistaken, sat for a BEd and then took the teacher eligibility test stood at something like 1% success rate. And that's obviously grown over time. You know, I know you because you nominated some schools for the World's Best School Prizes, of which one has emerged as a winner from Ratlam in Madhya Pradesh. And I look at that school principal and that school's teachers as a representative sample of such a massive system. And I just think, well, what is it that your work focuses on as people? Do you want to speak a little bit about what your interventions are and how you're helping chivvy along the system?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the core, what we work on is student engagement, improving student engagement. It sounds extremely logical and almost common sense. But, what has happened, I think, in the system is the government has focused and had a lot of success on getting kids into school, so on enrollment. And then there has been a midday meal program in all government schools. And so that's improved attendance. And so you're kind of sorted on enrollment and attendance. And where it kind of breaks down is on student engagement. Now, if the teacher and if the student is not meaningfully engaged, participating, questioning, understanding, involved in that process of teaching and learning, there's a lot less retention when it comes to learning. And that leads to poorer learning outcomes. So fundamentally at Peepul, we want to build this language of improving student engagement as the core of everything that we want to do. We want that vocabulary to kind of permeate the entire system. And both evidence, research, studies show that improved student engagement leads to better learning outcomes. And so if we can just have everybody anchored around this one core philosophy around improving student engagement, I think that's what we want to kind of build for the broader ecosystem. The way that we do that is, of course, when you work with government, it's of course not easy to do all of that because it's hard to improve student engagement, as you know, Vikas, in one classroom. As you've evaluated so many of these schools for the world's best schools and meeting teachers, you know how hard it is to even have, well-engaged, high student engagement in one classroom, and then to have it in one school. And then when you think about a state which has 100,000 schools, how are you actually going to replicate that across an entire school system? And that's the problem and the challenge that we have. And our solutions are very much about how do you actually replicate student engagement practices across an entire system at scale. So for us, there are two things that we do. One is we focus on strengthening the academic cadre. And by that, you work with school leaders, you work with teacher trainers, mentor teachers, supervisors to actually help them train and coach teachers more effectively so that they can actually provide support on how to be stronger teachers, how to provide academic support to children, how to be better in the classroom. The second part, which often gets ignored or left out of the equation, is academic governance. So there are many things that we do at scale with the government with regard to shaping, an annual training calendar for the state or an annual academic plan for the state. And so, if we just did the former, which is just strengthen the academic part without doing the governance, we don't truly move the entire system. We're not moving the mountain. We're improving practice in schools and hopefully for as many schools as possible. But to make systems change happen, we really have to also focus on academic governance. And I think with both of these things, the way in which we operate is very much co-creating, co-designing, co-implementing with the government.
And what are the results?
We now have a third-party evaluation across all of our programs. We operate in Delhi and Madhya Pradesh. Delhi is, highly visible because it's the capital. Madhya Pradesh, with 100,000 schools, is massive scale. Um, in our sandbox, which is our exemplar schools, which is where we showcase, we create the demonstration of what we think is possible. We build belief. We've had between, 1.5 to 2 times improvement in learning outcomes at grade 3 for English and math. When we take that to scale and we work through the government, I think what's been really heartening is in Delhi, we're seeing a 60 to 70% improvement across English and math at grade 3. And then in Madhya Pradesh, we're seeing a 60 to 65 improvement in grade 3 across English and math. Again, so the litmus test is, it's great you're able to do this yourself in the exemplar schools. How much of it can you actually translate when you're operating at scale? And I think our recent evidence is showing us that there will be a dip because you do lose control, but we've been able to control the delta dip, right? And so, a 60 to 80% improvement in student learning outcomes when the government is rolling it out is really heartening to us, right? It makes us really positive and optimistic about the change.
This podcast focuses on how you drive high performance, and you work in a very difficult kind of scenario, which is you're responsible for a set of schools and exemplar schools, but also you're trying to work in the public education system in 2 states, as an example. So what is your experience? And that can only be described as a very challenging thing for most people. So what is your method in making sure that you drive high performance across all of your work, especially with the states that you work in? Because that itself must be an exercise in so much stakeholder management and great communication. So tell us, in terms of, what are the 3 big lessons you've learned as to how you can be successful working in public education in India?
I think the first one is to always have clarity of vision, to be very clear about what we are intending to do. Because it's easy to get caught up in the detail, especially when working with other stakeholders. So I think, one, having the clarity of vision around what we're looking to do. Which, stakeholders are we looking to work with? What is it that we're trying to shift in the classroom? What are we trying to measure? All of those things. What's our end state? And how long are we going to work with the system? So having answers to all of those things is what I call clarity of vision. I think the second thing is understanding exactly which levers you have to be able to bring about change. So are you working with, teachers? Are you working with school leaders? Are you working with your mentor teachers? Again, having clarity around who your partner is in this journey, because that will help you shape your interventions. I think the thing that we often is very tempting for many of us is when you get demand from a government, or when you get demand from a partner or a donor partner or funder to do X, Y, and Z, you immediately say, yes, of course I will do it because I want to solve this problem immediately. I think it's equally, but you have to kind of resist that temptation to do everything. And I think understanding who the agent of change is, understanding the levers that are available to you, allows us to actually focus our work a lot more and not get into, drift or scope creep, which tends to happen. I think the third thing that has allowed us to really make strides and be successful is that we stay grounded and practitioner based. And I think we are respected by many partners in the government, at state government level and national government, for actually walking the talk. We run the schools ourselves. We know how hard it is. We have iterated, gathered evidence, and then we are going with a set of suggestions or recommendations that we want to solve together with the state. So having the practitioner experience, not being the organization that is going in and saying, we need the government to do these 5 things. There are enough people that do that. but actually engaging in that collaboration, having humility, keeping ego outside of the door. Um, that makes for a very strong long-term trust relationship, which is, I think, the secret to actually working on systems change.
Kruti, in this final segment of the podcast, I want to talk about your personal leadership because we've talked about the macro, which is education in India. We've talked a little bit about your work, about people and driving outcomes through student engagement and these kinds of things. We've talked about driving high performance in partnership with government. And the question now comes down to you're if you don't mind me saying, a young lady in India. Tell us about your recipes for success, because everything that you are doing should excite and inspire other people. And so, what are the 2 or 3 snippets that you would like to give people about your personal leadership style and what you would encourage people to adopt or learn from you for?
I think the first one is that I'm a very, I guess, people first kind of individual, or a people first leader. I really, for me, of course, the work is important, but what's also important is the energy that I get from everyone who's in the room. I want it to be a joyful experience to come into office every day, or go into the schools. I want it to be uh, something that we're all working on together. We're all in it together. And so for me, the people are most important. And I spend a lot of my time on just, getting to know people on the team, making sure that I'm connecting with them truly. Because for me, really, what makes the difference between us being successful in improving outcomes is really the people that are joining us in this journey to make that happen. And it's not a task, it's not just a metric, but the people really matter, right? So for me, people matter a lot. And I think if I were to suggest, or one of the things I think about my leadership style is that I really own that value. I think it really does matter to me, how people feel. I want to understand them. I want to connect with them. And that's when I'm able to understand their motivation and how they function. And that helps me build a much stronger team and a much stronger organization. So I think that's one. I think the second is a lot of us, I don't know. I'm young at heart, Vikas. I don't know if I'm young in the absolute sense, but I'll take the compliment. I think, many of us get very serious as people get older. And well, I think it's not age dependent, but many of us get very serious and kind of tied up in our own thoughts. And I think that when you're on a journey, when you're dealing with really complex social problems, I think it's important to have a sense of humor, to lead with calm and have grace under pressure. And so no matter what might be happening around us, one thing that I always go with is, well, it could always be worse. So let's just, continue to stay optimistic. Let's not overthink things. Let's kind of make sure that we're focused on solutions and do that in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary stress to everyone. Because I think, to me, that unnecessary stress that we often put on ourselves just leads to poorer team outcomes or organizational outcomes, right? So I think the second is just to step back, have some perspective and say, we're in this together. It will get solved. But let's stay calm and let's not get hyper about all of the things that are broken around us. I think the third is that it's important to have a point of view, but also listen to those that are around you. And as a leader, I think the role becomes much more around moderating a conversation than actually enforcing and providing your point of view. So I think I see my role having evolved also as a leader and my own leadership. I think of myself more as it's my job to teach others or coach others. And so in a meeting, I love to talk, of course, and I have to really rein myself back and say, no, it's, my job is actually to make sure that other folks are able to voice and then they walk their own journey around their professional growth. I'm not going to, tell them how to grow, but they'll walk their own journey. And it's my job to kind of hold their hand through their own professional growth. But the way I do that is by being more of a coach and a mentor, by listening, by moderating conversations, and then providing kind of nuggets and asking the right questions so that they are perhaps rethinking from a path that I think might go down the wrong direction.
When we, Kruti, when we think about leadership for a better world, which is a theme of the World School Summit this year, we think about solutions. We think about how education is connected to the state of the world. The question I really have, and maybe this is too big a question perhaps to ask, but perhaps you would just entertain me a little bit by considering this question, which is, what can the world learn from India when it comes to education?
I think there are many things to learn. I think one thing to learn is that even one individual can make a huge difference. One champion, one person who wants to make things better can just make a world of difference, even in a country that has such massive scale. I think that's one thing I would say, which is, I think, very 30,000 feet. I think the more specific things are perhaps there is a clear intent in the national government and then also in state governments to actually embark on education reform and policy redesign. And I think because it's such a large and diverse country, there are many things to learn from the different education reform journeys of each of the states. And so each state actually has, champions that are writing and scripting how to improve their system. And I think there are many practices that can be taken from India, from the states, that can actually be, Madhya Pradesh, for example, is, 4 times the size of the UK in terms of number of schools, right? There are just so many different practices that we see in that particular state, but also in school leaders, in teachers, that we can take and that other countries and school systems can replicate. So there is a lot to be learned around how the government is actually embarking on and addressing education policy and education reform.
Tell me about the impact of the school in Ratlam, which is now called Sandipani Vidyalay in Ratlam. What has been the impact of it winning or being shortlisted in our prizes on a system? Now, you talk about one person can have a massive impact. The principal of this school, Gajendra Singh, has been someone that continues to inspire through his energy, his approach, and his willingness to do things, for me at least. And when I speak to my friends who sometimes run private schools in India, and they speak to them about attracting school principals to their schools, and I sometimes say to them, saying, look, there's this guy in Madhya Pradesh, and they can't believe that there's a state school principal that is performing in such an incredible way, positive way. Is he the norm or is he an exception?
It's always hard, whether it's private or public school systems or in global corporations or not for profit organizations. It's always hard to find exceptional leaders. So I would start with that. It's particularly hard to find exceptional school leaders. And I think this is, a comment that's neutral of whether it's a private or public system. I think finding someone who is so driven and working within the constraints of the public school system is a breath of fresh air. It is almost, despite, so private schools have the luxury of having resources because they do have, they do have a revenue stream. In many government schools in India, the budget is primarily spent on teacher salaries. So you don't have a lot of leftover money to spend on resources. And so there is a real financial constraint. And to see that a school leader can overcome all of those hurdles and still translate practices into great outcomes is extremely inspiring and motivating for others. Having said that, there are many individuals and champions like Gajendra sir, who have been in the system, who have persisted and have been determined to do the right thing for children. And I think that we see that particularly when they have teams that they've been able to motivate in their assistant school leaders or their teachers, and when they are actually quite anchored around doing the right thing for the child. And the way that we create, I think, more Gajendra sirs is by providing a very supporting, enabling system to recognize people like him. Because, the minute that you give an exceptional school leader a platform and you actually recognize and reward and bring him into prominence, it becomes such a beacon for others to say, yeah, I mean, that's great. I can do that. Just the possibility gets completely unlocked, right? The possibility to make change happen and to see it translate into such a massive platform and recognition is just an inspiration for others. And there are many like him that we have seen when we have rolled out our work in across states. And there are many teachers who work in extremely different, in fact, I think some of the most inspiring stories are from teachers who work in very rural schools, because it requires a completely different level of motivation to travel 40 kilometers in a bus and then walk for 5 kilometers to get to your school, which has 40 children, and to teach for, 7 hours in the day. I don't know how long I would be able to do something like that, right? It's physically demanding, it's mentally taxing. And so but there are many people like that, and especially in rural areas. And I think that's what gives us hope. I think the more that we can spread stories like that, the more that, we start shifting the narrative around the public school system as well. We start showing that there is so much goodness that exists as well, that we can all just collectively tap into. And rather than talking about the shortcomings or talking about the data, let's make sure that we focus on the examples of good, and actually propagate them, replicate them, and spread them, just make them viral, and I think goodness begets goodness. So, the more of that we can do within a short period of time, you're building a movement for education reform, which is what will sustain and kind of for the long term really contribute to, education system transformation.
On that note, Kruti Bharucha, thank you so much for taking part in the Advanced podcast.
Thank you, Vikas. Lovely to be here.
Kruti, thank you so much for a thoughtful conversation. You reminded us that real transformation in education begins with strong leadership rooted in purpose and clarity. Before we close, you've shared 3 lessons that shape your approach to high performance. First, the importance of prioritizing time effectively and recognizing that time is our most valuable resource. Second, the need for honesty and visibility by giving feedback openly and helping others see thinking behind every decision. And third, the value of getting recruitment and talent management right to build teams that deliver lasting impact. I particularly picked up 3 additional lessons that you spoke about. One was to have a clear vision, a clarity of vision as to what you're trying to do. The second is understanding exactly what lever or what partner you have at your disposal to effect change, whether that be teachers, school leaders, policymakers. What is your lever for change? And the third really important point is to stay grounded and practitioner based. You talked about so much about actually running a set of schools and walking the talk, and that's where your impact is. And that approach is what stands you in good stead when people speak with you. When we talk about these lessons, they matter not only in education, but in leadership everywhere. Thank you, Kruti, for joining us and for your commitment to improving learning for every child. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow the podcast on your preferred platform. Download the episode, share it with a friend or colleague, and join us again for the next one.